Hello, everybody, and welcome to another one of our In Conversation with Lawyers video series. And I'm really pleased this afternoon that we've got Jon Tan with us. Jon was a graduate from Cambridge from the law tripos and has for the last 3 years, almost 3 years, been an associate at Linklaters in the Environment and Climate Change group. Jon, thanks very much for doing this with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me, David. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Why don't we just get straight in and say, what was your initial motivation for becoming a lawyer? What was it that was in your background or that you developed that motivated the desire to become a corporate solicitor?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So looking back, when I wrote my application for the University of Cambridge just under 10 years ago, I remember writing something fairly cheesy about how I was interested in the law as this overarching system that regulates how societies function. And looking at this kind of cover letter, and I queried, how much I genuinely believed in that as a 19-year-old. But at that point, I knew that actually I wanted to do something humanities related and was considering other disciplines such as political science or philosophy. So at that point, eventually I did choose to study law for actually the very practical reason that I thought it had very clear employment pathway as a professional qualification. And now in hindsight, I realized I probably could have also done a graduate diploma in law and become a lawyer through this other route. But obviously that hadn't occurred to me at the point in time. But really looking back, I think I found the legal education at Cambridge to be, really something special. And over time, and over the past couple of years working in the field, my interest in the law and the role that it can play has continued to grow. And especially within the field of work that I'm in, where I look at ESG and environment and climate change, you really see kind of the role that the law can do to shape societies by, where we are really working with these regulations that are trying to drive the climate transition to a net zero future. Yeah, so I think increasing now, if you look at the job market, I think ESG and environment has become a really big area. But when I was just starting out, just a few years ago, it was quite a different scene. So I would say my interest in, I guess, environmental and climate change law did start when I was at university. And I actually did my dissertation on international environmental law, and kind of the role and kind of how climate change and the obligation to mitigate climate change fits into this field. And that was kind of the first inklings of my interest in the topic. After graduation, I also did a bit of research as a research assistant at the Grantham Research Institute on climate change and the environment. So that's based at the LSE, and that allowed me to continue my my growing interest in that field. So with the kind of that background of an interest in the environment, I applied to Linklaters, which has had its dedicated environment and climate change team, and I think at that time it was one of the few standalone kind of environmental teams across the city. So it was one factor as to why I applied, and I was very fortunate to have been able to do a seat with the team during my training contract and eventually qualify back as an associate in the team. So I would say the work can be very varied, and this is really because of the nature of ESG, which the team has recently rebranded itself to. So ESG, for those that don't know, stands for Environment, Social Governance. And it is quite an amorphous concept, and includes things ranging from climate change to standard environmental pollution, to labor rights, human rights, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what you tend to see is across the city, lots of different firms that have ESG practices have slightly different formulations of ESG. So what an ESG team in Linklaters does might be different from what the ESG, maybe slightly different from what the ESG team in another firm would do. So in terms of my typical day, as I said, the work can vary quite a bit. So some of the things that I might, find myself involved in day to day would be, for example, doing environmental or ESG due diligence for a corporate M&A transaction, or I might be drafting an advisory memorandum on some of these ESG-related disclosure regimes that we've seen in the UK and the EU. Sometimes we conduct workshops for clients where we train them and upskill them on human rights due diligence and what this means from a regulatory as well as a soft law perspective. And in other cases, we really dive into the detail and look at some very nitty-gritty environmental law, which includes things like plastics, recyclability, and pollution. So it is quite a broad bucket of kind of environmental related work. Yes, no, definitely. It is quite a big part of what we do. So we do this both to kind of upskill internal legal teams where we would come in and talk to clients about what the regimes are, what they require, and how this will impact them as a business. Other times we also do kind of higher level sessions where we actually organize trainings for boards, to talk about ESG and what it means for the business. And with so much focus on the new ESG regulation and climate change across the market and across society generally, there is a lot of appetite for clients to learn more about what this means for them. So from my perspective, I think, and there are two key issues that immediately jump out. First is really the lack of harmonization and that we are seeing across the globe. So you have ESG reporting standards coming out in the EU, but we also see similar but slightly different standards being adopted in the UK, and even more different standards being adopted in the US. So this means that for clients that have operations across all of these jurisdictions, they would have it's just a lot of, I would say, almost bureaucracy that they'd have to get through to make sure that they comply with all of these three slightly different forms of regulation. And the other kind of big issue that we have really begun to see has been the politicization of ESG. So I think you see quite a lot of pushback in some sectors of society and some jurisdictions against this concept and against the transition to a net zero economy, which I guess from a legal perspective is very interesting to see, but for our clients who have to tread this fine line between the EU that really wants to drive this ESG agenda and jurisdictions like the US where there is some pushback in a number of areas on the transition. So this is quite a fine line to tread, and will probably be a big theme going forward. So I think there are a number of things that that students can do. I think firstly, there are quite a few young professional networks across the city and that look at climate change and ESG. So one that comes to mind is called Legal Voices for the Future, where they organize regular sessions with junior lawyers in the field or aspiring solicitors in the field to talk about different aspects of environment and climate change. So this gives students quite a good opportunity to really get some initial knowledge that they can then take into the interview process. I think the other thing that I would recommend students to do is to really keep to recognize that ESG and the environment is actually a really broad concept that isn't siloed within a singular ESG team or an ESG practice within a firm. So using Linklaters as an example, although we do have our standalone ESG team, we have specialists across the firm in lots of the different practice areas, such as litigation or banking, capital markets, that all do kind of climate change related work. So in our banking team, we'd have banking lawyers that look at sustainable finance, green finance, and I can say the same for our capital markets team. So really recognizing that if you want to do environment and climate change work, there are so many more opportunities to that across the market rather than just applying for what tend to be quite small specialist environmental teams. And this, I feel, really kind of broadens your horizon rather than making you focus for what would otherwise be quite a a smaller section of the market.